Thank you for checking out the first episode of this podcast. I am Justin Cox. This show is mostly for lovers of Jackson Browne's music, but it's not only for that. If you like his contemporaries or if you like one or two songs, I think there's going to be something you can find. So I will say that some of these episodes were recorded before the coronavirus entered our mainstream lexicon. This episode in particular did not. This one was recorded a few days after we were all told to start spending more time in our homes, but a few days before Jackson Browne himself came out and said that he had tested positive for coronavirus. I named this podcast before all of this happened, but it weirdly to me has taken on some kind of worthwhile meaning because the bulk of the episodes are going to come out while this is all happening. The definition of deluge is to inundate with a great quantity of something. And this song paints basically like a world-ravaging tragedy with the characters in it sort of left trying to sort out the mess and figure out what you do next. But you get this kind of beautiful respite in the chorus that says,
let the music keep our spirits high. Let the buildings keep our children dry. Let creation reveal its secrets by and by.
And so this is a weird time to talk about anything other than the thing that's occupying pretty much all of our brain space. But at the risk of sounding corny, I think that getting into some music can keep your spirits high. And this could be a good place to come do that. So I'm going to put out an episode a week over the next little while. And so today we start with his first album, which is technically called self-titled, but commonly referred to as Saturate Before Using as well. This album was released in 1972, and it's Jackson Browne's first studio album. It peaked at number 53 on the Billboard chart, and the single Dr. My Eyes peaked at number 8. So something I'll be doing for all these episodes from the 70s is looking back at the original Rolling Stone album reviews. These reviews exist independent of everything that comes after them. And I think there's just something cool about that. This is a person reviewing someone's album that came out in 1972, and that's it. I will interject some thoughts along the way, but mostly I'll just let the review carry the intro until I introduce our guest for today. These are pulled from a review by Bud Scopa, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that. Browne's voice is uncolored except for a bluegrass nasality. It's not a particularly powerful voice either, but it's quite flexible. It lends his vocal style an endearing, innocent earnestness that enables Browne to deal with overtly romantic themes without ever coming across as self-conscious or precious. To me, this is totally true. This is an album that makes no attempt to show off. It's just a collection of 10 songs that all stack right alongside each other so perfectly. And Jackson Browne's voice it's almost like the limit on his voice is an asset, and I adore it. And the crazy thing about that is that his voice is amazing. His voice is really good. It's just not the kind of voice that you say is the most amazing voice ever. I would never argue that Jackson Browne has one of the best voices in music, but I would very, very easily argue that he has one of my favorite voices in music, and I think that's the best way I could put it. Jamaica Say You Will, the opening track, is an exquisite love song, and it perfectly embodies Browne's writing and performing approach. This narrative of relationship between the singer and Jamaica, the daughter of a long-absent sailor, vividly confirms Richard Goldstein's 1968 perception that, quote, Jackson writes with rocky seacoasts in his head, unquote. The reviewer basically spends the next, half of the review talking specifically about Jamaica Say You Will, which I found at first a little weird, but then as I read, it was like what he was basically doing was unpacking Jamaica Say You Will so that he could then make a point about the album as a whole. And I think his point is good. So I actually enjoyed it in that way. And it's the kind of thing that you kind of maybe wanted to hear about some more songs, but I also respect the writer's choice for approaching it that way. Either way, to round out the review, it's romantic in the best sense of the term. His songs are capable of generating a highly charged, compelling atmosphere and of sustaining that pitch long after they've ended. Don't miss it. And so my guest today is William Matheny, who is an excellent singer-songwriter from West Virginia whose connection to Jackson Browne runs decades deep. We had a super cool conversation about not only this album, but his music in general and how it shaped our own thoughts about songwriting. And you will also hear one of his songs in full at the end of this interview. So stick around for that. For updates about this podcast, you can visit anchor.fm/afterthedeluge. You can also follow me at CoxJustin on Twitter. Subscribe to the show so you can follow the whole discography and tell any of your Jackson Browne loving friends to do the same. Here's our conversation. William, welcome.
Good to be here.
So this is obviously Jackson Browne's first album. I'm recording it now as we've all been self-quarantining for a few days. Every episode I recorded prior to this was at least 2 weeks ago.
Okay.
So our reality is totally different. How are you doing with all this?
Oh, I'm hanging in there. At the risk of trivializing what anyone could possibly be going through, this feels like a pretty appropriate record to discuss at a very, very strange time in America.
They're appropriate to a moment like this, even though there's no way you're even conceiving of a viral pandemic.
Sure, there's something about this record that has always really seemed, and I don't think this is actually a particularly uncommon read of his first handful of records. The songs almost sound like they're taking place after some grave disaster has, wiped out the grid or something. They sound like just the people in them are kind of like they've had to become agrarian again, and they're just kind of scratching by for survival or something.
Yeah, it's like this: we're occupying this wasteland. What are we gonna do now? And you're right; it continues on to like For Every Man and Before the Deluge, and those albums all kind of have a vibe of that.
Right. I think this is the only one that vibe continues uninterrupted for the whole 40 minutes. Because, For Every Man, you've got, Redneck Friend and, some kind of fun rockers. And Late for the Sky feels a little more modern. It sounds like people in the 1970s addressing their lives at that time, but it's like there's just something about this record that feels like it's really kind of in its own space, and it could be happening at any point in history almost.
No, totally. Even you have one of his biggest pop hits ever in Dr. My Eyes, ending with a chorus with "Is this a price for having learned how not to cry?"
That song reads way differently if you're listening to it in the context of the record too. It can stand alone, obviously, as a big pop hit, which it was. But when you listen to it in the album, it totally makes sense with the rest of that kind of really dark, after a disaster theme.
Yeah, you kind of alluded to it on For Every Man. That's the last one I recorded, and it has these amazing moments. But like you said, it feels disjointed in its way. Whereas, as you're alluding to now, this one feels like it manages to have a thread that ties through all of it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all kind of a piece, for sure.
We can go wherever we want to go with this, but I'll go to sort of the start of the album. I just love that you get Jamaica Say You Will and A Child in These Hills and A Song for Adam before you get that Dr. My Eyes, because it's sort of people knew who Jackson Browne was before this, but it's his first album, and it's sort of it tells you three things about him before it says, I'm aspiring to be a pop hit maker like the Eagles or something like that,
Yeah, it's an album that doesn't really meet people halfway, which I always have a lot of respect for as an artist. I'm really attracted to things that, they don't necessarily need you as a listener. As a listener, we maybe need it a little more than it needs us. And in the case of this, it really, really rewards hard listening. And honestly, the first time I listened to this record, I didn't really get it. I was 16, I think, and I had recently kind of gotten into Running on Empty as a record. And that one is really, really accessible, and there's a lot of fun stuff on it, even though it's still a Jackson Browne record, so there's plenty of substance even to the pop tunes. But so this was the next one I bought, and it seemed so austere to me. And I mean, it is, but it was just not something that I really kind of I don't think my teenage brain really grasped it immediately. But I stuck with it, and it, like within a few months, like it all made a lot of sense to me then. But, Jamaica Say You Will is definitely one of the more accessible songs on the record, even though I love an album that can kind of sort of start with a ballad like that.
Make us say you will help me find a way.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, the idea that Jamaica Say You Will is like some hard on the ears entry is not the case, but it's still that followed by those next two songs. It's like there's a certain type of listener who's gonna drop off at that point and maybe just not ever come back.
Well, yeah. I mean, and there's like some great scene setting with the whole thing too. Like it sort of sounds like it's maybe taking place like in some sort of like harbor town,
Yeah.
Then Jamaica Say You Will, followed literally by like a child in these hills looking for water, and then I read some interviews about like who the song Song for Adam is about, but I guess they're probably describing what sort of sounds like maybe little more than like gap year, I went to England kind of stuff, or, like people in their late teens and early 20s kind of like discovering the world and getting to travel and do all these things. But I don't know, the song makes it sound like it's just a lot more of like a serious kind of dark journey.
I don't need a song to make total sense for me to enjoy it. It can sort of abstractly make me feel something, and if anything, I love that.
Of course, yeah.
But Song for Adam kind of feels like the first moment that I get like a very literal story. And the chorus isn't. The chorus is the candle and all of that, but the verses are just, he's telling a story about some traveling he did with a person whose life was lost. And I don't...
Right.
I could be like one Google search away from having an answer to this question, but it's almost like I don't necessarily want it.
I sit before my only candle, but it's so little light to find my way. Now the story unfolds before my candle, which is
he does a similar thing on Something Fine with like the future hides and the past just slides and England lies between. Like England and you say Morocco, and that made me smile. Like those are clearly places, but those are also stand-ins for experiences and probably people. And it's just, he's really young and writing. That's just great writing. I love it.
Yeah, it was a record that honestly, like his youth, the more I learned about it, when I was, like I said, I was 16 when I got into this record, and it's an album that was kind of made by someone who was not that much older than me, really.
Yeah, he was early 20s. I was a little confused at first because he wrote These Days as like a 16, 17-year-old.
Yeah, like I kind of just got obsessed with how someone could really find like that kind of wisdom so quickly.
As you described that, I'm curious, you are a talented writer and songwriter and musician. Were you listening to this as you started learning and writing, or?
I had kind of my dad's old record collection, which, was something that I'd kind of been pilfering through my whole life. But in particular, like he got it back out and he said, like, you really should listen to Running on Empty. And he told me this story about when that album came out. He had just graduated from high school, and he was pretty, he told me he was kind of feeling pretty aimless about a lot of things. And he, his life didn't really fit into kind of like a college scenario, and in the same way that mine didn't either. And he was working this crappy job at a supermarket, and his grandfather had just died. And he just told me about coming home every day and just listening to Running on Empty. I didn't really get into it with like that same kind of like, I really hesitate to say depressive reasons, but there wasn't really like, there wasn't any emotional bloodletting for me with that record. Like, it was just an album I liked. Like, I loved, David Lindley's work on it. And like, that was really sort of my gateway to all of like the Mellow Mafia session guys who are huge reference points for me and the guys in my band. Like, we're always kind of trying to make the drums sound a little more like Russ Kunkel, but shortly after that, my uncle passed away, and also the band that I was in at the time broke up, and I didn't really have a lot of structure in my life for a few months, kind of while I was waiting to figure out what I was going to do next, which was, kind of join the first band that I was in that was like a serious thing that was recording music and trying to tour and all of that stuff, which was really what I wanted to be doing with my life. But I don't know, I sort of accidentally found myself in a pretty, I hesitate to say dark. I don't want to oversell anything, but like it was, a pretty downer period for me. And I got into this record, I guess much in the same way my dad got into Running on Empty, 30 years before that or so. Yeah, it's really kind of been with me ever since. And all of those records have. And I think he's just a brilliant writer that I don't think if it's possible for someone that popular to be underrated, I just don't feel like he's really in the conversation enough.
Yeah, that's really part of the conceit of this podcast, which I'm very aware of the fact that he is a popular musician, but
right.
He's not like Bob Dylan or Neil Young, and he's not a gigantic pop act like the Eagles or Bruce Springsteen. He's somewhere in this other thing that is kind of both, but is really, really, really good at both. And the people who like him tend to have stories like you just told about your dad and yourself. They have this thing that almost feels like it personally belongs to them, their discovery process
sure.
and all that. He tells a story, and you can kind of hear it in like the kind of bouncing of that piano key, the like dun 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 thing.
Doctor, my eyes have seen the years and the slow parade of fears without crying. Now I want to understand. I have done all that I could.
But like he was sitting at a piano that had like a broken hammer on its key, and so like when you take it down, when you'd hit the chord on the piano, it wouldn't stay and just sustain. It would kind of rock back and forth and sort of bang multiple times. And so he just sort of played that song to that rhythm and wrote the song around that, which is just as far as origin stories for the writing of a song go, like I can identify with kind of catching a very small groove and writing that into writing something more. But the idea of a broken piano key sort of paving the initial steps that would become a song like Dr. My Eyes is nothing cooler than that.
I love that. There's a scene, have you seen that Eagles documentary?
Yeah, I loved it.
Oh, I loved it too. It's like 8 hours long, and
yeah.
I just love it. Was great. They may not be my favorite band to listen to all of the time, but they're one of my favorite bands to think and talk about.
The Eagles very much have a place. First of all, they have a place in my heart, and then they're also a band. They're a band that I love in a lot of places and can't stand in a lot of ways. And honestly, they're kind of a through line through this whole podcast series.
How could they not be? But at the end of the day, fuck the haters. Those guys ruled.
Exactly. Yeah, they can say fuck the Eagles. We say fuck the haters. Fuck the Eagles haters.
Well, yeah. I mean, but anyway, there was just like a bit where like I like that scene where Glenn Frey is talking about living like above or below Jackson Browne at the time. And it was like, they were both pretty unknown guys, but like talking about just that discipline where like he would hear the tea kettle go off and then like he'd play, a verse of Jamaica Say You Will, and then play that same verse again and that same verse again. And then eventually something came to him. And I don't know, those kinds of stories are not probably far more ordinary than Keith Richards writing Satisfaction in his sleep, but most great things probably occur like that, really, that like it's just someone grinding it out until inspiration occurs, I love that kind of like I love the 70s California record making. Like it's there's just something pretty great about everything kind of made during that era that I can't really understand. There's like this magic dust all over the console, or maybe I mean that literally. It's probably just cocaine.
All the things can be true. Actually, I was going to ask about that. You're from West Virginia, and was your dad also in West Virginia at that time?
Yeah. I go way back in West Virginia. I'm not like a huge genealogy guy, but I think at least on my dad's side of the family, I know they go back to like 1870 or something like that. Wow. That I know about.
So I grew up in California, first Southern California, then Northern California.
I was gonna ask.
California's shaking like an angry child will, who has asked for love and is unanswered still.
I don't know, I used to I was a teenager and I loved listening to like The Strokes or the Velvet Underground because they made me feel like a cooler guy. Like it made me feel like an urban New York dude, and
Yeah.
which is just ridiculous because like I bought these albums like at convenience stores and at the mall in West Virginia, and I was driving around in like a Geo Tracker, but but like those albums always felt like that to me, and I think like a sense of place is really, really, a wonderful thing when music has that. And yeah, like those Jackson Browne records, like it feels like the West Coast to me, like in the same way that like Rumors does, or like a Judy Sill album or something like that.
And I guess I'm there and I'm from California, and so it feels a little less so to me, but I still I've romantically read about like all that scene around the Troubadour and all these songwriters, and I guess the way I don't see it is like, oh, it's a California record. I see it as like this was like a thing happening in Laurel Canyon in Los Angeles around this specific club and all these songwriters. So I guess I have my own version of it. It's just like I'm already in California, so the microscope is down on where in California.
Sure, and like that was obviously a really special time with a lot of really, really great things happening.
Something Fine was one of my original favorite Jackson Browne songs. Just
oh yeah, man, that line. I'm looking back carefully because I know there's still something there for me. Like, god damn.
And you know that I'm looking back carefully, 'cause I know that there's still something there for me.
Yeah, there's actually a lot of lines in that song that's another one. That's another one. It's like you're very, very deliberately not telling me everything, but you're telling me just enough to make me want to know so much more. And it's just like, how in God's name do you have so much in this one song that is just amazing? Whereas weirdly, Under the Fallen Sky was one that like later became a favorite song of mine. Like, and it's really fun to play, and it's just a super cool groove. I love that song.
I love the use of like congas on all these records. Really, like I think he, the jam bands kind of took the congas from us, but there's like some really, really great uses there that. I feel like a lot of like the 70s like singer-songwriter records had some excellent stuff happening with that. But in particular, like there's some really, really good aux percussion happening there.
Under the falling sky, easily we will lie while I bring it to you. It's a low road, a high wire going from me to you. And in your eyes, the distance left is closing. I got a feeling in my ocean.
It's like texture and vibe and stuff, not necessarily like your start to finish rhythm or something.
Well, yeah, and you kind of get like an extra layer of it. So it's kind of neat. Like it's the kind of thing that you maybe don't always like. You feel it more than you hear it. And I love those kinds of things because if they aren't there, you're going to notice it.
It's easy to think of him. Or I don't know, this is like kind of a dumb exercise sometimes, but what kind of music would you say Jackson Browne plays? Like for example, like he's a folk musician, he's a rock musician, he's singer-songwriter. What would be your answer to that question?
Well, honestly, like I really, I kind of love the answer singer-songwriter because it doesn't imply genre.
Yeah.
And that's sort of the same reason, not to talk about myself, but it's the reason why that's kind of my preferred term for what I do. I really like the term singer-songwriter because it's just the format of it. Like this is just someone who's, playing songs ostensibly. So, by that same notion, like Bob Marley is a singer-songwriter and Bruce Springsteen is a singer-songwriter. And I don't know, Kurt Cobain was too, or just about anyone you could like really think. And so I think it doesn't really like pin you into to really anything. Like, it just means that, like, as long as I'm doing what I'm doing, like, I can go wherever I want with it. At a certain point, like, the really great stuff just kind of becomes its own genre, really. It's like Tom Petty's sort of like a genre unto himself, you know, or in the way that, like, Patsy Cline was a genre unto herself, or, you know, Paul McCartney means a lot of things to a lot of people, you know.
I kind of entered in thinking of him as like a folk musician. I don't know why. I think I just thought like, oh, he's a person either with an acoustic guitar in his lap or sitting at a piano and he's writing these songs. But like you were talking about the congas, like they're like sort of production moments on this album, like that, like the congas on Under the Fallen Sky, or like the part at the end of From Silver Lake where he's singing one set of lines and the background singers are singing another set of lines. Like,
oh yeah, I love that part.
That feels post-apocalyptic. Like you're saying, it's like this is like both weird and dreary and dark, but like angelic at the same time, and is just that's way more than just a folk musician playing guitar or piano, right? And
certainly.
He was here the other day, but he only came to say that he can't breathe here.
I like that line, you know, on his way across that sea no man can measure, because it actually makes me think that, like, maybe these people are living in a world that's something has happened and we've actually lost all ability to like make maps, so you don't even know how big the world is anymore. Like,
hell yeah.
Yeah, maybe he was the first flat earther. I don't know.
Oh, God.
But no, there's all these like really like pretty heady moments, and it can, you know, it can certainly, like, he can certainly rock when he feels like it.
So looking into you, have you ever gone back to like try and check out a house you used to live in?
That's actually the one song on the record that suddenly does not feel like it's totally out of time to me. Like, because he talks about like hearing the highway whistle and whine, and like suddenly I'm picturing a guy in 1972 in California, like going back to look at an apartment that he lived in 5 years before that, you know. And I don't mean that in any kind of negative way, because it doesn't really take me out of anything. It's just, you know, to me that kind of like that song really sort of ramps up kind of into like the big finish before taking the record home, in a way. Like,
yeah,
it feels pretty epic, and great pedal steel on that song too. I realize that I'm really leaning heavily into like, yeah, that's great. Yeah, that's great.
Recording them at a time is like a process that I'm like needing to organize in my mind, especially now that we're like self-quarantined in our homes and all that. Like, but for example, I recorded the episode about Hold Out with the guy who wrote the Rolling Stone review for Hold Out, and it was a pretty critical Rolling Stone review, and you're like, man, I feel bad. Why did I spend so much time speaking in critical terms about this thing that I actually do like?
You know, if everything's great, then nothing's great.
Exactly.
And, you know, just because, yeah, I mean, like, if you're really a fan of something, like, I think you can kind of like go deep into it, have strong opinions about it. Like, it makes the things you love, you know, even more important to you. And I think that's, you know, you don't just want like total blind, you know, chanting of the name over and over again or something.
What has to be said, though, and you've kind of alluded to it, is that this one does manage to be 10 songs that do feel like they belong together, and kind of avoids dipping down into anything that is easy to be overly critical about, at least for me. Whereas even some of the other ones, which are albums I love, they get a little more into that territory. This one, it's kind of like, and it's someone's first album, it's like hard for me to really quibble with it, you know?
Oh, it's all killer, no filler. And I say that in the most, you know, most serious way possible, because it's not really a laugh a minute as a record. I feel like that song is sort of about, I always kind of took it to be sort of like about like your kind of journey, like early in life, you know, in sort of like a middle class Western existence, where you you're kind of figuring out what you're going to do. Maybe some people are going to college. In his case, he's like bumming around, being a songwriter, trying to make it, that kind of thing. Like, which is, is sort of a life path that I can relate to, and I've kind of been on the same, kind of scuffling around in the same way for my whole adult life, really.
Yeah. Do you mind if I ask how old you are?
I'm 35.
Cool. I'm 36.
All right. 80s babies.
Just a couple of millennials talking about an album from 1972.
It's perfectly natural. Just let it happen to you. I like how that song is, sort of like thinking about like, you first go out on your own, some bad apartment, and then, like, I guess just sort of like figuring out a life in music in a way. That's kind of how I've always meant it, or, that's how I thought it was. And in a way, it sort of made sense that maybe he's talking about Bob Dylan there as sort of like this model that all of those people were sort of like he presented a path to them that like, oh, well, I could do this because of that. And, I know that I've certainly felt that way about people. Like when you see kind of the way their career works or the way they approach the work itself, like you can see something for yourself in that.
Yeah, it's like I'm a white male in my 30s, and so I have those examples where it's like you kind of need to see something embodied to then have permission to be like, oh, I can go do a version of that. And it makes you understand like these conversations around like representation in movies and things like that, because people have to see.
Oh, it's so important.
You have to see a version of what you want to do, actually doing it in some form to kind of feel like you can do it.
And also too, it really like it goes to show you also how visionary the people are who are doing it for themselves with not seeing any examples of it.
Yeah.
Well, like that's even more remarkable and amazing.
Well, in my like early 20s, taking this song very literally and getting super into the full Jackson Browne discography, I took like a road trip down the California coast back to Southern California where I lived to like visit some family, see some friends and everything. And I went back by my old house that I lived in the like kind of suburbs outside of Los Angeles. And was like, and I'm like listening to this album on the way there and like creating this moment for myself where I'm listening to Looking Into You as I like pull into the neighborhood and like I'm gonna go over there and see who lives there now and I'm gonna talk to them. And like I get to the house and the house they'd installed like a really dark metal screen on it so you couldn't see through it, and like I knock on that thing, it's like clangs as I knock on it, then someone opens it, I can just see their like silhouette, and I was like, hey, I used to live here. I was wondering if I could like just talk, like catch up or whatever. And the guy just like looked at me and just said no and just swung it shut. And I was like, God damn it.
They were having none of it.
Yeah, I was like, haven't you heard the first Jackson Browne album, man? This is supposed to be a really big moment for me. But
in the film of my life, this is important.
Yeah, I was like creating my own soundtrack for this big moment, and I guess he gave me a different moment. I could have written about that, or I guess I did hang on to it.
That's great.
So you kind of spoke about Looking Into You as like this, it's kind of building up to something, and Rock Me on the Water, I think, like delivers on what that's doing.
Yeah, like that was, early on, that was my favorite song on the record, is Rock Me on the Water, and I still really like it. I love the gospel piano on there, and that's a pretty like important element of like my band. Our piano player Jeremy is really, really great at that style of playing, and there aren't very many people who are doing that these days. So I'm always very grateful to have him around because he's kind of got the chops under his hands to do that. But
cool.
Yeah, man, like Rock Me on the Water is a really, really heavy one for me, and it still is. Like it's just kind of one of those songs that's been a favorite for years and years and years, and that's one that I knew, from the radio, because it was kind of one you would hear on classic rock radio for a bit as well. Yeah.
It's another
one,
which
is pretty unlikely. A very strange song to be played on the radio when it comes right down to it.
I think what he kind of sneaks by with on some of these songs is like give it a real hook, like Rock Me on the Water, what he sings there.
Rock me on the water, sister, will you soothe my fever brow? Rock me on the water, I'll get down to the sea somehow.
In delivering it to you in that package, you're kind of getting everything else about those songs that has a whole lot of substance, and it doesn't just like fill in the space between the choruses you sing along to on FM radio.
Yeah, and also like how sparse that song is. Like, dynamically it's kind of all over the place. And it's so rare to hear something that naked on the radio. Even if it's not the whole song, like you still have like a solid minute where I think it's just piano and voice.
That was also one of my favorite songs. And I think, so I got into Jackson Browne through my dad, who you told your story of how your dad found him. My dad was like working like a sales route that had him driving around Los Angeles a lot. And I think The Pretender had come out, and he got into the Pretender first. And like, you think about your dad's experience and my dad's experience, there's like nothing better than when you find a musician who you love, who's already like 4 albums in, and you're like, you didn't just get 1 album brought into your life, you just got 5 albums brought into your life, because you now get to go backwards. You don't just have to wait for the next ones, you have all of it. That's like, the idea that you find this stuff at the Pretender and then go backwards is awesome. But I know that in my dad's process of going backwards, Rock Me on the Water became a song that he fell in love with and played a lot, and everything. It was a song that I like can remember hearing in my childhood, even before getting into this album myself in my teens.
So this was JB was a guy around your house a lot then when you were growing up.
Yeah, definitely.
I
think around the time that I'm Alive and Looking East came out, those albums, like my dad had those CDs. It was kind of like peak CD buying.
It was 1993 or something, right?
Yeah, most of what I heard of the old ones were honestly a greatest hits album that I had, and the process of like getting into all of them individually, I'm actually really glad, was a thing I did on my own. Honestly, in its own weird way, because I want to love these songs forever. I like am protective about how often I listen to them. Like I'll take like a year-long break without listening to it, so that I give myself the gift of coming back to it.
There's so much out there that like it's kind of overwhelming to think that like there's so much being made that like you could listen to music for the rest of your life and not hear all of it. And like that kind of bothers me on some level, but at the same time, it gives you a lot to do in the year that you're taking off between your favorite records,
Yep.
And yeah, I know what you mean, but like it always kind of this album in particular, it always sort of it kind of resets everything for me whenever I hear it. The world slows down a little bit. I can breathe a little deeper. It does something to me that, all of my favorite music does.
The last track on this album is a literal farewell. What do you think of my opening Farewell as a song and as the last song on your first album?
I mean, you'd be hard pressed to do better.
Yeah.
But that also, like, I think sort of like reinforces like the apocalypse themes too. Like it feels very much like, this woman out in the desert somewhere, like who maybe hasn't seen people in days, Yeah. And it feels like something, it just right after something awful has happened, and the world is like putting itself back together.
The conversation we were having earlier about production and sort of the subtle things instruments are doing and everything, this one just feels like 5 instruments doing their own sparse different things all coming together. Like
it's really masterful, and it's so everything is really intentional. Like nothing is happening on accident with all of that. Like that bass line.
And you'll soon be gone, that's just as well. This is my opening farewell.
Is just incredible. Like the way it sort of like runs as a counter to a lot of stuff, and just all the moves that everyone was doing on this record, they're perfect.
The kind of thing we haven't gotten into is that like Jackson Browne was a thing.
But he was like in the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band for a minute, and then like he played for Tom Rush, and then he was like a known staple of like the troubadour scene and all of that, and people were recording his songs and all of that kind of stuff. And that's he was definitely working and like building toward a thing. For sure.
Right. And so he has harmonies on this album by David Crosby. Like you don't have that unless you're already doing some stuff.
You got Cross on there. You got Clarence White on guitar. Like it's pretty crazy. I mean, David Lindley has yet to sort of make an appearance, but
to me, those first 5 albums, there's a lot of his music I like. I don't want to like diminish what he does in the 80s and 90s, and I kind of haven't put my brain there yet because the only one of these I've recorded from that is Holdout. But the first 5 albums are so amazing to me, and they all kind of feel like they belong together. And then the one kind of weird little thing in that is that David Lindley's not on this album because he's like a constant on all those.
Right, and I mean, it is kind of one of the things that really differentiates it, and I think it makes it honestly makes it a little more solemn. Like there isn't really like the playing is amazing on it, but like really with the exception of like the guitar solo on Dr. My Eyes, there really aren't any like there are no like kind of fireworks happening, like no flashy stuff,
Yeah.
As opposed to like the Lindley thing where it's like you've got this like great lap steel happening and all this other stuff. And I kind of wonder what it would be like with him on that record. Like I don't, but I don't really know how you could really outdo it as it is. Like, it might not jump up and down, but it's just perfect.
Yeah, if anything, I guess it's like it's kind of cool to have this piece that existed before that next chapter came, right? It kind of gives you something new on For Every Man, and then you get like David Lindley at peak on Late for the Sky. And
yeah, that's kind of like the full flowering of sort of what I think of as sort of being like the Jackson Browne sound that it's the sound that launched a million DAWs, including DAWs.
What about the record cover? What do you think of that?
Oh man, it's great. Like the water bag, yeah, love it.
And what do you when you refer to this album? What do you call it?
I always called it Saturate Before Using, but I think I'm doing that incorrectly.
I know I do too, and I kind of, for these purposes, because I think it was officially just released as self-titled, I've been like in an official capacity calling it self-titled for like the purposes of his discography, but I think that you can just call it Saturate Before Using now. I think that kind of like became a thing, and it's fine.
Well, I want to respect JB's wishes here. So, I mean, I know that he was kind of like, he was afraid people would think that's what the album was called, and I don't think he wanted it to be called that, but, it's sort of like calling the album the White Album. No one calls that self-titled,
Right. I think Late for the Sky is his best album cover, but I think this is the most iconic. This is
it's pretty wonderful. Like, and I think that like the original pressing, it was actually like a burlap bag that it came in, which is even cooler.
Right on. Nice. Well, thanks so much. Anything else? Any parting thoughts?
No, but thank you for talking to me, and I'm probably gonna go put it on right now.
Yeah, thanks for a good hour-long break in the quarantine.
I don't really get to talk about this record or honestly Jackson Browne enough, so thanks a whole lot.
You can follow him on Twitter at William_Matheny, Matheny, and you can find more information about his music at WilliamMatheny.com.
As long as I can do all the driving myself, I won't be handing the wheel off to anybody else. If the station's tuning in, I'll turn the radio on. I can roll down the window and stick out my arm. Got idle hands that need a feeding. I got some secrets I've been keeping. And I don't hate the way I'm feeling, though I probably should. But it's alright for now. Set him up, Joe, and play